Hello everyone and welcome back. Think back to the early 1990s when the Trumpet first began forecasting that the Islamic Republic of Iran was the biblically prophesied king of the South. At that time, Iraq was the biggest threat to stability across the region, but look at where we are today. Iran has taken over Iraq. It now controls 4 capitals in the Middle East, and it's racing to build a nuclear bomb. Who would have thought 20 years ago that Iran would be the king of the South, or the king of the Middle East, the king of this radical Islam movement? As I said there at the top, I mean, back then a lot of the focus was on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. The United States, of course, going to war against Iraq in the early 1990s. But let me show you what we wrote. This is in 1994, the first version of this. It's been updated some over the years, but in essence, this is what we said as early as 1994. The stage is being set for an Islamic group of nations, almost certainly to be led by Iran as the prophesied king of the South, to push at the king of the North, which is the European Union. It says Iran has a foreign policy with a lot of push. That's what we were alerting our readers to in the early 1990s, a very pushy foreign policy. And of course, at that time, Iran was working to accumulate a large arsenal, weapons of mass destruction. He says, and since the end of their war with Iraq in 1988, Iran has accumulated a massive arsenal of military weapons to back up its aggressive foreign policy. And now, of course, 2 decades on from that, you have this nation close to getting a nuclear weapon. And now, I mean, it's just moving through the Middle East at will. This is the latest article in our Trumpet magazine, Iran's stranglehold on the Middle East. Timely as ever, as always. If you're not a subscriber, make sure that you go to thetrumpet.com and sign up for your free subscription to the Trumpet magazine. Iran's stranglehold on the Middle East. That's what it is. As my father said on the Key of David, we've pointed it out here on the Trumpet Daily as well, that the focus, really, it's not where it needs to be in the Middle East. As dangerous and as violent as the movement of ISIS is, I mean, this is at another level. Iran, the Islamic Republic, when you think about its arsenal, when you think about how close it is to acquiring nuclear weapons, and even without those weapons yet, it's just gobbling up one nation after another, Yemen being the most recent domino to fall, the Houthis' takeover of that little nation, a little nation but very strategically situated, right there at a passageway where there's a lot of flow of oil and world trade. And you have Iran expanding its influence. This is a quote from not 94, but from the recent Trumpet, April 2015. My father said the Houthi takeover in Yemen proves that Iran is implementing a bold strategy to control the vital sea lane from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. You can see it just by looking at a map. There's a map on the cover. There's one on page 5 in the featured article here. You can see these pressure points. And now with Sana'a, this capital of Yemen, the latest to fall, that gives Iran control of 4 world capitals. If you count Damascus, Beirut, and Baghdad, and now Sana'a. And then, of course, there's Iran itself, expanding its influence around the world, gaining control of these passageways through which so much oil goes through. You have the little Strait of Hormuz over by Iran, and then of course the narrow strip next to Yemen as well. and Saudi Arabia, sandwiched in between, getting very, very nervous. Israel getting very, very nervous, as was brought out in Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent speech before Congress. Iran's spreading its influence. It's tightening its grip of control over Yemen, over Iraq, as we'll see here in just a second, over Syria, over Lebanon, all of these places. And then now they're about to get nuclear weapons. And evidently, the United States is just going to step aside and allow all of this to happen. I want to direct you to a more recent article from the Washington Post. The title of this article, as you can see, is "The Strategic Genius of Iran's Supreme Leader." It says, after years of defiance, Khomeini seems to appreciate that his most advantageous path to nuclear arms is through an agreement. To continue to build up his atomic infrastructure without the protective umbrella of an agreement exposes Iran to economic sanctions and the possibility of military retribution. They're exposed. I mean, those sanctions were hurting them, as Mr. Netanyahu brought out in that speech. I mean, they were really hitting Iran hard, and now the United States and the Western nations are prepared to lift those sanctions, most likely, and to allow the money to start flowing back into the country. And who's going to prevent them from continuing to build a nuclear arsenal? This article continues, for Khomeini, it says, the most important concession that his negotiators have won is the idea of a sunset clause. Upon the expiration of that clause, it's a 10-year window, basically. Upon the expiration of that clause, there would be no legal limits on Iran's nuclear ambitions. Once a deal is transacted, the most essential sanctions against Iran will evaporate. So the sanctions will be removed. There's the sunset clause that after 10 years says Iran can basically do whatever it wants. And of course, those naive leaders in the West are looking at that as, well, that buys us 10 years. But as Mr. Netanyahu brought out in his speech, 10 years is nothing. 10 years is nothing in the affairs of mankind, of human civilization. That's what Iran wants. One last quote here. And as far as the use of force is concerned, the United States has negotiated arms control pacts for at least 5 decades and has never used force to punish a state that has incrementally violated its treaty obligations. That's just the reality of the situation. That's from the Washington Post. Look at North Korea as an example. Were they punished once they crossed the nuclear threshold? And they're not nearly as belligerent as Iran is and expanding its influence. Just toppling over pro-American governments in Yemen, for example. And now this nation, which repeatedly says it wants to destroy Israel, is very near to the point of getting a weapon that can actually do that at just the push of a button. Is this dangerous? Is the situation in the Middle East today a powder keg that's about to explode and draw all the major powers of the world right into that vortex? Well, that's what the Bible says. That's what the Bible has prophesied. Another article from a Middle Eastern paper, as nuclear talks drag on, how Iran is slowly encircling Israel. It says Tehran is no longer even bothering to hide its aggressive expansion throughout the Middle East, even as nuclear negotiations continue. I mean, if the focus isn't on ISIS, it's on these nuclear talks, or in the United States, it's on senators that send a letter to Iran and how dangerous that is and how divisive that is in Washington, when the focus really should be on them acquiring a nuclear weapon and them taking over nations. One other quote from this Middle Eastern paper, it says, this Israeli paper, in the last year, Iran has deepened its involvement in Iraq, aided Yemen's Shiite Houthis in conquering their country's capital, and facilitated Hezbollah's most expansive deployment in its history. It goes on and talks about how it's now encircling Israel with this presence it has in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza even, the West Bank. They're closing in. Going back to this recent Trumpet, the article that my father wrote about the stranglehold. He said Iran is aggressively securing its foreign holdings along the Red Sea and boasting about how it could use them. Yet the United States is apparently allowing Iran free course in an effort to win it over in nuclear negotiations. I mean, they're not exactly trying to conceal their strategy in Tehran, and the United States isn't exactly concealing it either. There's been articles that have come out in Western papers about just how desperate the United States is to make a deal, how desperate the U.S. is. As hard as these sanctions are hitting Iran, it's really the United States of America that's more desperate for whatever reason. There's probably a lot of them, but desperate to make a deal. It's not so much that this is a story about Iran's genius, although that one article I quoted to you certainly makes some valid points. The bigger development here is that the United States is just stepping aside and letting all of this happen, along with other major world powers. Well, there's one power that's going to stand up to it, and soon. But what we're watching right now is this radically led Islamic movement taking over the Middle East, much of it, and about to obtain nuclear weapons. Look at this headline. This is from the Telegraph here in the UK. How a U.S.-Iran nuclear deal might transform the balance of power in the Middle East. That's the online version. This was the article in the Sunday Telegraph just from a few days ago. It says, "Deal for peace in our time that threatens a new era of turmoil." Look at those images. Look at those images. A deal for peace in our time, and it's threatening to plunge this world into a time of turmoil like it's never seen. Let me just take you to a few quotes from the article itself. Iran, for its part, wants to deliver an emphatic message, even if its diplomats compromise over the nuclear program in the interest of ridding the country of sanctions. It says, General Soleimani, now notice this, and his comrades will ensure that the Shia Islamic Republic remains a rising power determined to reshape the entire Middle East in its own image. As the general himself told the official media in Tehran, this general, by the way, is in Iraq right now, leading the forces against ISIS. And this is what he said to the official media in Tehran. He said, "Today we see signs of the Islamic Revolution being exported throughout the region, from Bahrain to Iraq and from Syria to Yemen and North Africa." I mean, as I say, they're not even concealing anything. And this is the movement, really, that we should be concerned about most. Maybe they're being a little more subtle than ISIS, but they are gobbling up large swaths of territory. And it's alarming the nations in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia. You can understand the outrage, to what ISIS is doing, but that's the small Islamic State. What about the much larger, more dangerous Islamic State? That's the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is from the Washington Post, just from yesterday. Iraqi forces break militants' hold on Tikrit in major battle against the Islamic State. Finally, the Islamic State is being pushed back by Iraqi forces. And who are those Iraqi forces? There's no U.S. troops there. Well, there's some estimates that say 2/3 of the forces are from Shia militia groups, led by General Soleimani, the man that was in that article, the leader of Al-Quds, the great general in Iran. He's in Iraq, leading the charge, pushing ISIS out of Tikrit. And you'll see that continue, because ISIS is no match for Iran, and evidently this has the United States' blessing, because, well, ISIS is so evil. But like the Prime Minister said before Congress, I mean, the enemy of your enemy is your enemy. And it's a much bigger, more dangerous one. That's just the reality. Let's just read one more quote from that Sunday Telegraph piece, March the 8th. It says, already Iranian tentacles spread far and wide. In Lebanon, the Islamic Republic has more direct influence than any other foreign power, thanks to its umbilical relationship with Hezbollah, the radical Shia movement. It says in Syria, General Soleimani has quietly masterminded Bashar al-Assad's struggle to stay in power, deploying thousands of troops from the Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah. In Iraq, it says, General Soleimani is commanding the struggle on the ground against ISIS, reinforcing his country's ironclad alliance with the Shia-led government in Baghdad. It says, and in Yemen, Shia rebels have taken over the capital, Sana'a, with the benefit of Iranian weapons and support. All this has led Iranian officials to boast that 4 Arab capitals, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a, are under their de facto control. They're boasting this now. They're boasting of taking over control of these world capitals. Finally, it says here, if this could take place in the teeth of sanctions and Iran's bitter rivalry with America, then what might happen if a nuclear deal sweeps away the embargo and brings the superpower's enmity to an end? That's a good question. If this is what Iran does when the United States is there trying to restrain it, what happens when those restraints are lifted? What happens when the sanctions are moved? What happens when the United States just turns and looks the other way as Iran races to the finish line to get its nuclear weapon? Let's look at Daniel 11 and verse 40, a verse here that we've read so many times before. The verse that talks about this king of the south. Verse 40, it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Push. And the king of the north, it says, shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now, we identified this king of the south more than 20 years ago, as I said at the top. This radical Islamic movement headed by Iran, the head of the snake, as we've called it so many times. This movement that just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing in the Middle East, pushing its way through foreign capitals, pushing into Europe even, pushing its radical foreign policy on other nations, pushing for a nuclear deal, pushing to acquire a nuclear weapon, pushing to grab hold of these powerful and strategic trade routes, as this article in the Trumpet talks about. Push and push and push. And of course, as this verse also mentions, there's another power that's going to emerge that will, in the end, come against this king of the south and all of its proxies. That's talked about, of course, as the king of the north, that European superpower that's now forming, led by Germany. Well, so much of this is talked about, as I said, in this most recent issue of the Trumpet magazine, the April edition, this feature article, Iran's Stranglehold on the Middle East. It does have that stranglehold, and it's building toward the fulfillment of this prophecy and several others. Make sure if you don't have your subscription that you go to thetrumpet.com and get a free subscription to this magazine. Lots of the articles that are in there, of course, appear on our website, thetrumpet.com, as well, so you can get them right away when they're posted. But become a subscriber, too. And also, just to further your study on what we've talked about here today, my father's given a program recently on the Yemen crisis. He's talked about the Jerusalem powder keg as well. And then there's also the booklet that's advertised on the back of this issue, the King of the South. Let me just read to you what it says here. Islamic State, Iran, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. It says the Bible explains them all. The Bible really does tell us. The Bible really does show us what's about to happen. It, as it says here, it forecasts their immediate future here in the 21st century. That's how you can know, as long as you understand Bible prophecy with God's help. That's how you can know where these nations fit in and what's just ahead of us. So important that you understand God's sure word of prophecy, as it's called in Scripture. Well, that's all we have time for here today. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.